The snow had already begun falling when I arrived home, bundled against the bitter wind, my small child in my arms. I paused at the door, fumbling for the key, and that's when I heard it. My parents' voices drifting through the hallway, light and dismissive. Eliza, still struggling with the simplest things, my father laughed. A soft, casual cruelty. Maybe if you weren't such a mistake, you'd have done better by Haley. My mother's chuckle followed, a delicate echo that cut sharper than any storm. I froze, my heart tightening, warmth slipping from my hands. No explanation, no context, just their satisfaction in my discomfort. I tucked my child closer, pretending I hadn't heard, yet each word branded itself. And then, the front door swung open behind me, though I hadn't heard it unlock. I'm Eliza, and for most of my life, I've lived in the shadows of my parents' approval, always careful, always measured, yet somehow always wrong. Haley, my sister, glided through life untouched, while I bore the weight of their quiet disdain. I wondered, as I brushed snow from my coat and carried my child inside, if anyone would ever see the truth behind their smiles. But that night, watching the flicker of frost on the windows, I realized something had to change. Most days, I moved like a shadow in my own home, anticipating every need, smoothing over invisible cracks my parents refused to acknowledge. I managed the bills, cooked the meals, and tended to the little emergencies they never noticed, all while Haley drifted in and out, her life untouched by responsibility. They praised her effortlessly, her laugh, her choices, her presence, but when I faltered even slightly, I became the problem. Even my child's birth didn't shift the balance. I gave everything I had, sleepless nights and tender worry, yet my parents' words cut through every accomplishment. "You're always overreacting," they'd say. "Haley handles things with grace." I learned early that silence was my only shield. Speaking up invited ridicule. My carefulness became my armor, but it also isolated me. And yet, I continued, because this was home, because this was family. I told myself it was enough to protect my child, to give them a life my parents never could, or would. But that night, as I watched the snow press against the windows and heard Haley laughing in the living room, I felt a tightening in my chest. Something in me shifted when I realized that for decades, I had been measured, minimized, and quietly robbed, and no one would stop them unless I did. The quiet ache of betrayal pressed against my ribs, and I knew, in that frozen moment, that I could no longer pretend. What had been theirs to take might finally become mine to reclaim. At first, it was small things, comments meant to sting, casual dismissals hidden as concern. My parents would ask about my child's health with a false sweetness, then shrug when I mentioned extra care or medical bills. "You worry too much," my mother would say, eyes glinting with amusement. "Haley never fusses like this." Each remark was a pinprick, easy to ignore in isolation, but together they formed a pattern I could no longer deny. Even within the home, the imbalance was obvious. Haley's needs came first: clothes, gadgets, privileges, while my careful planning and savings were constantly questioned or reproposed. I noticed bills mysteriously missing, receipts vanishing, my contributions unacknowledged. I tried to voice it once, carefully, presenting numbers and details. My father's polite smile and my mother's sudden cough were all the dismissal I needed. They wouldn't hear me. No one did. I started keeping quiet, not because I didn't care, but because silence allowed observation. I began to notice how they calculated every word, every smile, every glance, as if each was a chess move I had yet to understand. I could feel the imbalance deepening, my child's needs brushed aside whenever they conflicted with Haley's comfort. Then, the evening came when my child's asthma fled in the freezing snow, and they, my own parents, stood at the door, offering no help, no warmth, only their familiar superiority. I held my child tighter, shivering not just from cold, but from the realization that the small signs had been warnings, and I had ignored them at my peril. And in that moment, as the wind howled outside, I understood this wasn't just neglect. It was a choice, and I would have to respond. After that night, the subtle games turned bolder. My parents' confidence seemed unshakable, as if my silence had become permission. They moved through the house with ease, critiquing my parenting in front of Haley, their favorite audience. "Eliza, maybe you should take notes," my father said once, watching me comfort my child, so you don't make mistakes like this again. Haley laughed lightly, leaning against the wall, as if my humiliation was entertainment. It wasn't just words. They began reallocating my savings, claiming it was for family emergencies or Haley's future, while I silently tallied the growing discrepancies in my mind. Every transaction, every subtle redirection of my hard-earned money became another reminder. My parents were using me, exploiting me legally, socially, and emotionally, all while smiling in the warmth of my own home. Yet the public face remained flawless. Outside, friends and distant relatives saw harmony. Inside, I was the one bending under invisible pressure, forced to measure every word, every reaction. The contrast was maddening. They had perfected the art of social manipulation, my grievances dismissed, my contributions erased, while Haley thrived unquestioned. I began documenting quietly, not yet ready to act, just observing the rhythm of their control. Every comment, every small theft, every calculated dismissal was a thread I could pull later. And as I stacked evidence silently in my mind and in hidden folders, I realized something chilling. Their confidence wasn't just arrogance. It was overreach. And overreach, by nature, carries risk. That night, after tucking my child into bed, I found a note slipped under the door, my mother's handwriting, delicate and mocking. Maybe next time, you'll see what a mistake truly costs. And in that single line, I felt the first real spark of clarity. The game had begun, and they hadn't noticed that I was already planning my next move. They started rewriting reality in small, careful ways. If I mentioned missing money, my mother tilted her head and said I was stressed. If I showed bank statements, my father sighed and told me I'd always been dramatic. Haley stayed quiet during these moments, scrolling on her phone, occasionally glancing up just long enough to look bored. "You're tired, Eliza," my mother said once, placing a hand on my shoulder like comfort. "You've always imagined problems." I began questioning myself. I replayed conversations in my head, examined numbers twice, then 3 times. I wondered if exhaustion had blurred my judgment. Caring for a child with asthma, juggling work, surviving emotional whiplash, it all added up. Maybe I was misreading things. Maybe this was just how families worked. They isolated me expertly. Calls with relatives happened without me. Decisions were made in rooms I wasn't invited into. When I tried to join, the conversation shifted. Suddenly it was about Haley's plans, Haley's dreams, Haley's needs. I learned to swallow words mid-sentence. At night, when my child finally slept, I sat alone in the kitchen scrolling through old messages, old emails, trying to piece together timelines. My savings account no longer matched my records. Transfers I didn't authorize sat quietly in the history. Still, I said nothing. Not because I didn't care, but because I was tired of being told I was broken. What hurt most wasn't the money. It was the way they looked at me when I spoke, like I was inconvenient background noise. Like my existence was something they tolerated rather than valued. Some evenings, I caught my reflection in the dark window, eyes hollow, shoulders tense, and wondered how long I'd been shrinking without realizing it. Then, one afternoon, while searching for my child's medical paperwork, I opened the wrong folder on the shared computer. Inside were scanned documents I had never seen before, and one familiar number at the top of the page made my stomach drop. The document was my disability settlement. My name sat neatly at the top. The amount matched what I had received years ago after the accident. Money meant for long-term security, medical needs, and my child's future. But beneath it were signatures I didn't recognize. I scrolled slowly, heart pounding. There were withdrawal authorizations, transfer confirmations, a timeline that stretched back years. They hadn't taken everything at once. They'd siphoned it carefully, patiently, disguising it as shared expenses and family support. My hands trembled as I printed the pages. When I confronted them, I did it calmly. No raised voice, no accusations, just facts. My father leaned back in his chair. My mother folded her arms. Haley didn't even look up. "That money helped this family," my mother said. "You lived here too." I pointed at the paperwork. "You never told me." My father shrugged. "You would have wasted it anyway." Something inside me collapsed quietly. They didn't deny it. They justified it. By evening, I was told to stop digging into things that didn't concern me. My mother reminded me whose house this was. My father suggested I take a break, maybe see someone about my stress. Haley finally spoke, her voice light. You always make things weird, Eliza. I went to my room and sat on the edge of the bed while my child played silently on the floor. Everything I thought I had, safety, family, stability, felt suddenly conditional. That night, I checked my account again. Another transfer had gone through. And this time, it emptied what little I had left. I stayed at the screen until it went dark, realizing they weren't afraid of consequences anymore. They thought I was finished. What they didn't know was that while they were draining my future, I had already saved copies of everything. And tomorrow, I was going to start building a timeline. I didn't confront them again. Not after that. Instead, I went quiet in a way they mistook for defeat. I cooked. I cleaned. I took my child to appointments and nodded politely when my mother commented on my posture or my parenting. I let my father lecture me about gratitude. I listened while Haley talked about new clothes and weekend plans, paid for with money that had once been mine. They relaxed. People always do when they think they've won. Inside, I was cataloging everything. Dates, amounts, conversations. I stopped reacting emotionally and started observing like an outsider. Who accessed the shared computer? Who handled the mail? Which accounts were linked? Which documents were missing? At night, after my child fell asleep, I rebuilt spreadsheets from memory and bank alerts. I photographed files with my phone. I forwarded emails to a private address they didn't know existed. I didn't cry anymore. Crying wastes oxygen. What surprised me was how easy it became to wear neutrality. My mother praised my new attitude. My father said maybe I was finally growing up. Haley barely noticed me at all. That invisibility became my advantage. They began speaking freely around me again, assuming I was too exhausted to pay attention. I heard fragments about refinancing, about consolidating paperwork, about a meeting scheduled soon that I didn't need to be part of. One afternoon, while folding laundry, I overheard my father say, "Once everything's finalized, Eliza won't have any claim left anyway." I stood perfectly still, holding a small sock in my hand, listening to my future being erased in the next room. That was when I realized this wasn't just about stolen money anymore. They were preparing to lock me out completely. And whatever they were planning was already in motion. Once you stop hoping people will change, you start seeing them clearly. I replayed everything in my mind, not emotionally, but structurally. The timing of transfers, the way my mother always handled paperwork, how my father framed decisions as already made. Haley's selective silence whenever money came up. It wasn't chaos, it was coordination. They hadn't just taken advantage of me, they had built a system around it. Every dismissal followed the same pattern: minimize, redirect, isolate. Every financial move had been preceded by a casual conversation about family needs. Every major withdrawal happened after I'd been emotionally exhausted, after a hospital visit, after a sleepless night with my child, after they'd reminded me how difficult I was. They weakened me first, then they acted. That realization changed something in my chest. I stopped viewing myself as unlucky. I started seeing myself as targeted. I opened my laptop one night and laid everything out on the table: bank records, printed documents, screenshots, timestamps. I mapped events on a simple timeline. The shape of it emerged slowly, then unmistakably. Years of quiet extraction. Years of consent manufactured through pressure and shame. My disability settlement hadn't disappeared. It had been managed. By them. I also noticed something else. Every major transaction routed through one shared email account. My mother's. That was when the fog finally lifted. They weren't impulsive. They were deliberate. They believed I lacked the clarity and the backbone to challenge them. They believed motherhood had made me soft, that exhaustion had made me harmless. I closed my laptop and sat in the dark, listening to my child's breathing from the next room. For the first time, I didn't feel small. I felt precise, and as I stared at the timeline glowing faintly on the screen, one thought settled calmly into place. If they were building something behind my back, then all I had to do was let them finish. I didn't tell them I knew. That was the most important part. Instead, I leaned into the version of me they preferred. The quiet one. The tired one. The daughter who nodded too easily and asked for nothing. I let my mother handle the mail. I let my father speak for the family. I let Haley assume I was too consumed with my child to notice anything else. Meanwhile, I built a parallel record. I requested historical bank statements directly from the institution. I recovered archived emails through an old backup account they'd forgotten I had access to. I cross-referenced dates with medical visits, pay stubs, and benefit deposits. Every transfer lined up with a moment of vulnerability. Every authorization traced back to the same IP address. Their house Wi-Fi, their shared computer, my mother's login. I also reached out quietly to the legal aid office that had helped me years ago after my accident. I didn't accuse anyone. I simply asked questions. About settlements. About misuse of funds. About what constituted coercion when family was involved. The answers came back slowly, carefully, and they changed everything. I learned that disability settlements carried protections they had ignored. That financial consent obtained under emotional pressure could be challenged. That property purchased using those funds, even partially, could be reclaimed. I also discovered something else buried in old files. The house. It hadn't been bought outright by my parents, like they always claimed. My settlement money had been used as the primary down payment. My name appeared in early drafts of the ownership documents before being quietly removed during refinancing. They hadn't just stolen from me. They had rewritten history. I saved copies of everything to a secure drive. I'd backed it up twice. I started keeping a handwritten log of conversations, noting dates and exact phrasing. I even recorded one exchange where my father casually admitted they'd reallocated my money because I owed the family. They were building their future. I was building a case. And the best part, they still thought I was broken. They still spoke freely in front of me, which was how I learned about the upcoming meeting. A conference room, paperwork, final signatures. They thought it was the end of my claim. I knew it was where the truth would finally surface. Something quiet happened inside me after that. Not anger, not grief, clarity. I stopped waiting for them to acknowledge what they'd done. I stopped hoping Haley would grow a conscience. I stopped rehearsing conversations in my head. Validation no longer mattered. Justice did. I began moving differently through the house. Slower, steadier. I answered questions with fewer words. I stopped explaining myself. When my mother criticized my parenting, I simply nodded. When my father offered advice I hadn't asked for, I thanked him and walked away. Haley barely registered my presence anymore. They mistook my composure for surrender. What they didn't see was how focused I had become. I started dressing more carefully when I left the house, not out of vanity, but intention. I scheduled appointments during their work hours. I kept my phone on silent and my notes organized. Every interaction became data. Every dismissive comment confirmed what I already knew. I also began preparing my child, gently. Not with fear, just structure. Extra clothes packed. Important documents copied. A small emergency bag hidden in the trunk of my car. Safety first. Emotion later. At night, I practiced what I wouldn't say. I wouldn't beg. I wouldn't accuse. I wouldn't raise my voice. Facts don't need volume. I replayed the upcoming meeting in my mind. The conference room. The documents. Their casual confidence. I imagined my parents sitting across from me, expecting compliance. I imagined Haley scrolling on her phone, bored. And then I imagined the moment the narrative cracked. I felt no rush, only readiness. They believed control came from authority. I understood now. It comes from preparation. And as I zipped my child's jacket the next morning and watched my mother leave with a folder tucked under her arm, I realized the transformation was complete. I was no longer reacting to their choices. I was waiting for them to walk into mine. I didn't rush anything. That was my discipline. I scheduled a formal consultation using the legal aid referral, presented my documentation without commentary, and let a professional confirm what I already suspected. I didn't dramatize. I didn't editorialize. I handed over timelines, bank records, screenshots, and the audio clip. The room stayed quiet for a long time. Then I was told, very carefully, that what had happened wasn't just unethical. It was actionable. From that moment on, every step became deliberate. I drafted a written statement while the details were still sharp. I notarized copies of key documents. I created a clean folder labeled by date, not emotion. I emailed myself summaries after every interaction with my parents. I stopped using the shared computer entirely. I also learned exactly how conference room meetings worked in their bank, who scheduled them, who attended, what paperwork had to be present for signatures to be valid. My parents thought they were preparing to consolidate ownership. I was preparing to reclaim it. I arranged for a neutral third party to attend under the pretense of financial clarification. I didn't tell my parents why. I let them assume it was routine. They were eager. My father even smiled when he mentioned the appointment, telling me it would simplify things for everyone. My mother reminded me to dress professionally. Haley rolled her eyes and said she'd come if she had time. I thanked them. At home, I packed my child's bag and left it in the car. Important papers went into a slim folder I kept with me at all times. I backed up my drive once more. Then I waited. Not anxiously. Quietly. Because once paperwork enters a formal room, stories stop mattering. Only records do. The night before the meeting, I stood at the window watching snow gather on the streetlights, my child asleep behind me. My phone buzzed with a calendar reminder my mother had sent. Conference room, 10 a.m. Finalize everything. I stared at the words for a long moment. They thought this was their victory lap. They had no idea they were walking into a room where their version of reality would finally be audited. And for the first time since all of this began, I slept without rehearsing what I would say. I didn't need speeches. I had evidence. The conference room smelled faintly of coffee and printer ink. Neutral. Sterile. Designed for decisions that change people's lives. My parents arrived first, confident and composed. My father carried a leather folder. My mother greeted the receptionist by name, already acting like this space belonged to her. Haley slipped in last, scrolling on her phone, barely acknowledging me. No one asked how my child was. They sat across from me the same way they always did, expecting compliance. My father opened with practiced authority. We're here to finalize ownership and clean up loose ends. Loose ends. That's what they called me. I placed my folder on the table and folded my hands. I didn't interrupt. I let them speak. I watched how relaxed they were, how comfortable in the story they'd rehearsed. My mother nodded along, occasionally adding details about refinancing and consolidation. Haley sighed dramatically when paperwork was passed around. They thought this was procedural. They thought I was just there to sign. When the bank representative asked if everyone understood the documents, my parents answered for me, like they always had. Yes, Eliza's fine with it, my mother said lightly. I met her eyes for the first time that morning. I'd like to wait, I said. The room shifted. Not loudly, just subtly. My father frowned. Haley finally looked up. My mother tilted her head. That familiar gesture meant a signal I was being difficult. Wait for what? My father asked. For the clarification meeting, I replied. His smile tightened. What clarification? I didn't answer. Instead, I slid my folder forward. Inside were timelines, statements, authorization records, and copies of documents they believed I'd never seen. The bank representative began reviewing them slowly. My parents leaned back, unconcerned. They still believed this was a misunderstanding. They still believed they controlled the narrative. That illusion lasted exactly 3 minutes. Because that's when the door opened again. And the person I'd invited stepped inside. And suddenly, no one was smiling anymore. Dr. Lane entered quietly. No dramatic entrance. No authority in posture, just calm professionalism and a folder held neatly under one arm. My mother stiffened first. My father straightened in his chair. Haley looked between them, confused. This is Dr. Lane, I said evenly. He specializes in financial coercion cases tied to disability settlements. The silence that followed was heavy. My father laughed once, short and dismissive. That won't be necessary. Dr. Lane took a seat anyway. The bank representative paused mid-page. My mother leaned forward, voice sharpened. Eliza, what is this? I didn't answer her. Dr. Lane opened his folder. He spoke gently, but each sentence landed with precision. He outlined how my settlement funds were protected, how third-party access required informed consent, how prolonged emotional pressure combined with financial redirection met the legal definition of exploitation. He referenced timestamps, IP addresses, authorization patterns. My father interrupted twice. Each time, Dr. Lane waited, then continued. My mother tried a softer approach. We were helping her. She's always overwhelmed. Dr. Lane nodded politely, then slid forward a printed transcript of my father's recorded admission. The room went still. Haley whispered, "Dad." My father cleared his throat. She owed the family. We gave her a roof. Dr. Lane looked at him calmly. Housing does not grant ownership of disability funds. My mother's composure finally cracked. You were always ungrateful, she snapped at me. After everything we did? I lifted one finger. Just one. The bank representative raised her hand slightly. Mrs. Collins, please. My mother stopped. That was when my father made his mistake. He leaned back, crossed his arms, and said, too confidently, "Fine. Yes, we moved the money, but the house is ours now. That's already done." Dr. Lane opened another document. Actually, he said quietly, based on the down payment source and the refinancing irregularities, the house legally remains traceable to Eliza's settlement. He slid the page across the table. My father reached for it. His hand froze halfway, because his own signature stayed back at him. Acknowledging receipt of funds. Acknowledging fiduciary responsibility. Acknowledging liability. Haley stared. My mother's lips parted without sound. My father whispered, "That's not." Dr. Lane finished the sentence for him. "It is." And in that moment, I watched something extraordinary happen. Their confidence didn't shatter loudly. It drained. Slowly, like air escaping a sealed room. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't lean forward. I let the room do the work for me. The bank representative adjusted her glasses and began reading aloud transaction dates, amounts, authorization trails. Each figure landed with quiet finality. Dr. Lane added context only when needed, pointing to specific clauses, specific protections, specific violations. Facts moved through the room like cold air. My mother tried once more. Eliza agreed to help. She was part of this. Dr. Lane didn't even look at her. He turned to the representative. "May I show you the consent timeline?" She nodded. He placed 3 documents side by side. On one, my medical discharge summary. On another, a withdrawal authorization. On the third, a time-stamped email from my mother requesting access to my account. All within 48 hours, he said calmly. Repeated over several years. No accusation in his tone. Just structure. My father stared at the table. Haley whispered, "Mom." My mother reached for Haley's hand, but Haley pulled away. The representative looked up. "Mrs. Collins, Mr. Collins, do you deny these transfers?" My father opened his mouth, closed it, then said, quietly, "No." That single word carried more weight than any argument ever could. The representative nodded once and began outlining next steps: account freezes, formal investigations, provisional property claims. She used phrases like fiduciary breach and coercive control. She explained that ownership of the house would be re-evaluated based on the source of funds. No drama, no yelling, just consequences unfolding in real time. I spoke for the first time in several minutes. "I'd like my name restored to the property record," I said. "And I want all future communication to go through counsel." My father finally looked at me, not with anger, with disbelief, like he had only just realized I was capable of this. The representative nodded. "That can be arranged." My mother started crying, not loudly, just quietly, the way people do when performance no longer works. Haley sat frozen, hands clenched in her lap. No one tried to comfort them. Dr. Lane gathered his papers. The meeting concluded without ceremony. As we stood, my father said my name softly, like it might still carry authority. "Eliza." I didn't respond. I picked up my folder, thanked the representative, and walked toward the door. Behind me, chairs shifted. Someone inhaled sharply. And just before I stepped out, I heard my mother whisper, "This isn't over." I paused, not to turn around, just long enough to answer, evenly, "It already is." And when the door closed behind me, I knew something irreversible had just begun. The fallout didn't arrive loudly. It arrived through emails, phone calls, quiet notifications. By the time I reached my car, My legal aid contact had already forwarded confirmation of the account freeze. The bank flagged prior transactions for formal review. A provisional lien was placed on the house, pending redistribution tied to my settlement funds. Process. Procedure. Paper trails. This was how accountability actually looked. Inside the building, I could see my parents still seated through the glass wall. My mother had folded inward, shoulders rounded. My father stared straight ahead, jaw rigid. Haley stood apart, speaking rapidly into her phone, pacing like someone who had just lost gravity. They didn't follow me. They couldn't. Their world had narrowed to signatures and consequences. Over the next few days, the story spread quietly through extended family. Not gossip, documentation. Copies of filings. Official notices. My parents tried damage control, but explanations collapsed when confronted with records. People stopped returning their calls. Invitations disappeared. The version of them that relied on charm no longer functioned. No one attacked them. No one needed to. Reality did it for us. Haley sent one message. I didn't know it was that bad. I didn't reply. Because she had known. She had just benefited from not caring. By the end of the week, I received formal confirmation. Temporary sole access to the house, pending final ownership restoration. My parents were required to vacate during investigation. My name was back on the documents. Not symbolically. Legally. They packed in silence. My mother avoided eye contact. My father carried boxes like a man moving through fog. Haley left without looking at me. There were no dramatic goodbyes. Just doors closing. That evening, I walked through each room slowly. The walls felt different. Quieter. Like they were finally exhaling. My child ran ahead of me, touching door frames, laughing softly. And standing there, in the middle of a space that had once erased me, I realized something important. They hadn't lost because I fought them. They lost because they underestimated stillness, because they confused endurance with weakness, and because they forgot that records remember everything. But even as I locked the front door, keys cool in my palm, I knew this wasn't the end yet. There was still one final reckoning waiting. And it wasn't theirs. It was mine. The legal process moved forward without spectacle. Not in courtrooms filled with voices, but through certified letters, scheduled calls, and carefully worded confirmations. My settlement funds began the slow return. The house title was formally reassigned. My parents were instructed not to contact me directly. Everything went through representatives now. Distance, finally enforced. They tried once. A message from an unfamiliar number. No apology, just confusion dressed as concern. I deleted it. Haley never reached out again. Some family members sent quiet notes of support. Others stayed silent. I didn't chase explanations from anyone. I had learned that people reveal themselves when consequences arrive. My child's doctor adjusted the asthma treatment plan. We moved furniture to create clearer airflow. I replaced heavy curtains with lighter ones. Small changes. Practical changes. The kind that make breathing easier in more ways than one. I returned to work slowly, choosing stability over urgency. I opened a new savings account in my own name. I framed copies of the finalized documents and stored the originals in a safe deposit box. Control doesn't feel dramatic. It feels organized. One afternoon, I found an old photo tucked into a drawer, Haley and me as children, standing in the same hallway where my parents once told me I was a mistake. I looked at it for a long time, then placed it back where it belonged. In the past, that evening, as snow began falling again, I cooked dinner while my child colored at the table. No shouting in the background. No tension humming through the walls. Just quiet domestic sounds. I didn't feel victorious. I felt settled. And that was better. Because peace isn't loud. It arrives gently, when everything that shouldn't have been yours to carry is finally put down. Later that night, after my child was asleep, I stood by the window and watched the snowfall. It came quietly, each flake finding its place without asking permission. I thought about how long I had tried to earn love that was never meant for me. How I had mistaken endurance for loyalty. How I had been taught that silence was virtue, even when it cost me everything. I walked through the house slowly, touching door frames, straightening a chair, turning off unused lights. These were small rituals, but they mattered. They reminded me that this space was finally mine, not just legally, but emotionally. I checked on my child once more, brushed a curl from their forehead, and felt something soften in my chest. Freedom doesn't arrive as fireworks. It arrives as breath. I went back to the front door, slid the deadbolt into place, and listened to the click echo through the hallway. It was the most beautiful sound I'd heard in years. Not because it meant I had won, but because it meant I was safe. Because it meant the past couldn't follow us anymore. Because it meant my child would grow up in a home where love didn't have conditions. I didn't feel powerful. I felt present. And sometimes, that's the quiet victory no one talks about. When you stop surviving and finally begin living.